His body is a map of old wars under glistening skin, and yet the lens never fetishizes his strength. It lingers instead on the breath that trembles in his chest, the pulse fluttering below his jaw, the quiet glances toward the edge of the ring where a small girl's eyes are reflecting the whole world back at him. On Scenecraft Review, I want to walk you through what this 2026 release accomplishes with brutal tenderness, how it uses violence the way a poet uses silence, where every punch lands not just in a body, but in a life. This isn't a film about a fighter who falls. It's a film about what falls out of a man when the fight is taken away, about poison as a substance and as a metaphor, and about the fragile miracle of a child whose blood type becomes a bounty. The opening match is staged like a confession. The crowd is a living organism, a chorus of appetite. But the sound mix sneaks away from them and presses its ear to Paul's ribcage. We hear his breath, then the ring bell like a prayer, a bell thin and metallic and swallowed by the echo of the roof. The cinematography bends time without resorting to slow motion. Instead, shots are held a beat too long, and cuts happen a blink too early, so your nervous system begins to anticipate pain before it arrives. Paul's stance, once proud, has a shadow in it, a slight delay on the pivot, a sub-perceptual looseness on the guard, and then the little betrayal. A cornerman passes him a bottle. It's a runtime with detail. The camera gives it to us without alarm. Cap cracked, condensation clinging, the label a tear in the hand. Paul takes a swig, wipes his mouth, and his gaze tilts infinitesimally enough that the color curve cools and the edges of the arena soften. The director trusts us to recognize the horror of something small that moves the earth. When the poison kisses his bloodstream, the fight choreography recalibrates. It's not the melodrama of a heroic collapse. It's the more unsettling logic of misfires. He reads a feint correctly, but reacts half a beat late. He goes to counter with a knee, but his balance stutters, as if the floor inhaled. The blows he absorbs aren't flamboyant. They arrive at angles that distract, a temple clip, a liver whisper. His opponent's confidence grows with an almost gentle smile, the smile of a man whose realized gravity has shifted in his favor. Cuts stay close to Paul's face, tracing his consolation, the way an expert knows how to turn his energy when bleeding out is inevitable. And in the second round, when his daughter's small voice floats onto the soundtrack, just a tiny puffer, it lands like a meteor inside a dark sea. He goes down on a hook he should have survived. He doesn't get back up. The chaos after a loss isn't shot like news footage. It's staged like a crowded dream. People's mouths open, but the sound ducks away under a static hum. Camera movement is handheld but steady, as if the operator is determined to keep faith with Paul's point of view, even as it wobbles. The contract men, the corner arguments, the grieving face of his wife at the edge of the apron, the flashbulbs that bleach faces into masks. This is not scandal so much as drowning. He stumbles down the corridor toward a locker room lit like a clinic, and the white light seems to make the guilt floose from his skin. A rival steps in, a man he beat a year ago with surgical precision. In this moment, more a symbol than an enemy. Words are traded that the sound mix refuses to grant us coherently, as if articulating rage would deflect from the real target. Hands grab, a bottle skitters, and the camera shifts focus to the fragile coin of his daughter's pendant bouncing at his waist as the scuffle spills into the tunnel. The tragic accident isn't sensationalized. It's captured with a restraint that is almost cruel. A shove sends Paul stumbling back, not towards the man, but toward an equipment cart, and in that collision an unsecured metal pole pops free and arcs into the hallway like a dull spear. The camera doesn't track the pole, it follows Paul's face as he turns to the sharp intake of breath from everyone around him, the sound of air evacuating a life before the shriek. When the cut comes, it is surgical to a frozen tableau. The child on the ground, a bright scarlet ribbon spreading on concrete, her eyes startled more by the suddenness than with fear. The soundtrack scrapes away everything but the faintest reverb of the arena's distant music, and in the space left behind sits an old, simple silence that feels as if it has always been waiting. Paul takes one step, two steps, and the whole frame tightens like a pupil in bright light. When his voice arrives, it is underwater. Face during this monologue is still a topography of no, you don't understand, he says, and the line is so simple because the film has earned the right for the simplest lines to be scolding. He steps out of the car without slamming the door, which is how you know his rage is under control. People who need to hear a sound they made slam doors. People who mean it make their silence hurt. As the second act crescendos, Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer deploys a masterclass of cross-cutting. On one side, Paul's return to the ring is arranged like a ritual, not a resurrection. The lighting is less theatrical than before. The color temperature runs warmer, insisting on flesh tones rather than the brutal blue of the earlier matches. The audience isn't a mob, it's a collage of longing. Some faces recognizing him with forgiveness, others with curiosity, some not looking up from their phones. His opponent is not a hero or a villain. He is a working man whose body is his job. There is no vengeance to take here. The fight is real, and the choreography is respectful. On the other side of the cut, Vinny moves through a labyrinth of errands, with Reen under a hooded jacket, past offices where air conditioners drip onto ancient potted plants, past a woman asleep on a waiting room chair. He's trying to secure the paper that says this child has permission to be safe, which somehow is harder than staying alive. The fight itself, when it lands, is a mirror. The camera abandons the spectator's exhilaration and sits on the ring apron level with the ropes, so our horizon line is at belly height. The bodies are heavy. The blows sound like wet laundry hitting a stone. Paul's technique is not younger, it is wiser. He knows where to be, so the fight does not happen there. He absorbs only what he must. His eyes are clearer. They patrol the space like a sentry who has finally remembered that the real enemy is not an opponent, but the moment he forgets to breathe. He does not look to the corner where once a child watched. He looks inward where a crowd of broken promises has taken a knee. When he lands a clean hook, the cameras cut not to his face, but to his feet, because balance is the real victory. Mid-round, there's a freeze, not visually, but in rhythm. Everything pauses when Paul makes a choice not to follow a downed opponent to the mat. He steps back. He lets the referee do his job. The director could have made this a grand moral gesture. Instead, it is quiet and functional. And perhaps that is the revelation. Redemption isn't a firework, it's the decision to hand someone back their breath. The crowd doesn't cheer, they exhale. In that same instant, across town, Ben's men arrive at the cousin's house where Vinny left Reen for a short nap. The house is simple and honest. Doors are always open except when they must close. The knock is gentle, the men are polite, and the dread is a rope drawn tight inside a chest. Sound design plays scheme here like a second narrative. During the fight, the ambient roar is shaped into musicality. During the approach to the cousin's house, the ambient quiet is manipulated into tension. A bird calls once. The second time we expect it, it doesn't. A motorcycle passes, and then the soundtrack holds the absence of the second motorcycle that should follow. The cousin, a man who reads comics and brews coffee too strong, opens the door with a smile that could be for a neighbor. He doesn't have the training to perceive danger and the softness, and the film doesn't judge him for that. Rerin sleeps on a couch with a blanket patterned with oranges. Back in the ring, Paul takes a body shot that knocks 20 years of breath out of him, and for a second, the cinematography renders the world in desaturation, not to dramatize pain, but to show an interior experience of it. He steadies. He remembers the first time he was hit like that, in a gym where he was too proud to admit that he puked. The present remains. He clenches his jaw, not in defiance, but to locate himself. The bell rings. He walks to his corner and sits. The corner man he could afford is a kid with scruples who's better at physics than empathy. "Your timing's good," he says, as if reporting on a machine. Paul nods, and in the nod, like a smile with too many teeth, he is trying to get a piece of paperwork that would allow Rain to be admitted to a hospital if needed without questions, and the clerk refuses on technical grounds that might be legitimate in another movie. Paul tries reason, then patience, then stillness. The camera holds him in profile as he listens to rules being explained to a man who would walk across fire without blinking. He leans forward, not as a threat, but as a man who was done negotiating with the air. He stands up, thanks the clerk, and realizes that the only institution powerful enough to grant him legitimacy again is blood and bruises and a ring. It isn't that he thinks fighting will solve anything. It's that he knows violence is a language he speaks fluently enough to write a request letter in. The training begins in the most uncinematic gym imaginable. Cracked mirrors, ropes that smell like mildew, pads that have known too many histories. There is no coach with a cigar and a heart of gold. There is an old janitor in flip-flops who knows how a mop is held and how a left hook miss a line when a man has been favoring his right hip for too long. He says little, he points with his chin. Paul hits the bag and learns how his body has become an argument between his will and his joints. The camera is merciless but not cruel. It watches him fails with him. His shoulders are tight in new places because grief finds muscle to live in. He does not push through it with a scream. He stops. He breathes. He continues. Ruin watches sometimes from a corner with a notebook, drawing 2 circles connected by a line that, when asked, she says is a new alphabet. "What does it say?" he asks. She shrugs. It says things out loud without shouting. Parallel to this, Vinny does what men without weapons do. He makes schedules, he organizes safe places, he makes deals. He dances with Ryan Uno's threats, trying to turn them into calendars instead of ultimatums. There is a scene where he sits on a motorbike in the rain under a flyover, eyes closed, waiting for time to pass, because sometimes the smartest move is to be a hole in the net. The sound design during these sequences plays with the bass frequencies of car tires on wet asphalt, an ocean that never sees the shore. His scenes become the quiet interstitial tissue that binds the film together. He is neither hero nor victim. He is the math that keeps a child in a bed, that keeps a stove on, that keeps a man from deliberately bleeding out. Ryan's thread arc is fascinating because it refuses to give him a single mask. In a private dinner with investors, he laughs at a joke about altruism and later sends money to a hospital anonymously, and both gestures are true and untrue at the same time. He is a man who believes that morality is a spreadsheet with columns we can format until the numbers tell a comforting story. He tries to buy Paul off in a scene set in a car where the city moves past like an impatient tide. You return to the ring, you do what you do best, and the boy, he stops remembering it is a girl. The child will be fine. Paul's face during this monologue is still a topography of no. You don't understand, he says. And the line is so simple because the film has earned the right for the simplest lines to be scolding. He steps out of the car without slamming the door, which is how you know his rage is under control. People who need to hear a sound they made slam doors. People who mean it make their silence hurt. As the second act crescendos, Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer deploys a masterclass of cross-cutting. On one side, Paul's return to the ring is arranged like a ritual, not a resurrection. The lighting is less theatrical than before. The color temperature runs warmer, insisting on flesh tones rather than the brutal blue of the earlier matches. The audience isn't a mob, it's a collage of longing. Some faces recognizing him with forgiveness, others with curiosity, some not looking up from their phones. His opponent is not a hero or a villain. He is a working man whose body is his job. There is no vengeance to take here. The fight is real, and the choreography is respectful. On the other side of the cut, Vinny moves through a labyrinth of errands with rain under a hooded jacket, past offices where air conditioners drip onto ancient potted plants, past a woman asleep on a waiting room chair. He's trying to secure the paper that says this child has permission to be safe, which somehow is harder than staying alive. The fight itself, when it lands, is a mirror. The camera abandons the spectator's exhilaration and sits on the ring apron level with the ropes, so our horizon line is at belly height. The bodies are heavy. The blows sound like wet laundry hitting a stone. Paul's technique is not younger, it is wiser. He knows where to be, so the fight does not happen there. He absorbs only what he must. His eyes are clearer. They patrol the space like a sentry who has finally remembered that the real enemy is not an opponent, but the moment he forgets to breathe. He does not look to the corner where once a child watched. He looks inward, where a crowd of broken promises has taken a knee. When he lands, plays scheme here like a second narrative. During the fight, the ambient roar is shaped into musicality. During the approach to the cousin's house, the ambient quiet is manipulated into tension. A bird calls once. The second time we expect it, it doesn't. A motorcycle passes, and then the soundtrack holds the absence of the second motorcycle that should follow. The cousin, a man who reads comics and brews coffee too strong, opens the door with a smile that could be for a neighbor. He doesn't have the training to perceive danger in the softness, and the film doesn't judge him for that. Ririn sleeps on a couch with a blanket patterned with oranges. Back in the ring, Paul takes a body shot that knocks 20 years of breath out of him, and for a second, the cinematography renders the world in desaturation, not to dramatize pain, but to show an interior experience of it. He steadies. He remembers the first time he was hit like that in a gym, where he was too proud to admit that he puked. The present remains. He clenches his jaw, not in defiance, but to locate himself. The bell rings. He walks to his corner and sits. The corner man he could afford is a kid with scruples who's better at physics than empathy. "Your timing's good," he says, as if reporting on a machine. Paul nods, and in the nod is a complicated goodbye to an entire identity he's had to drag behind him like a damaged limb. The kidnapping attempt is not cinematic in the way action movies are. It's cinematic in the way dreams turn to static and then fear inserts itself into the frame. One of the men steps into the room where Ririn sleeps because invitations have been written in the language of debts. He pauses at the blanket's edge, and in that pause, we see he is not a monster. He is a man who has decided that because he needs to eat, someone else's child has to be a ledger entry. Then sound snaps into focus. A thump of stairs of running water faucet, laughter too bright for the hour. Vinny arrives. He calculates threats like he calculates grocery prices. He improvises a misunderstanding. A neighbor returning a borrowed bowl, a ridiculous charade that almost works because sincerity is a substance that confuses men who work in abstraction. He gets Ririn out of the room. He gets as far as the doorway. It's not enough. The film interweaves the fight and the failed escape with a precision that is almost cruel. As Paul steps back into round 3, as he adjusts his guard in a way that would make his old coach proud, as his body starts to find the groove it once rolled like a river, we cut to Vinny making a call to a number he shouldn't have memorized, bargaining with a man who doesn't bargain. "Take me," he says. "You are not on the list," Ririn replies, not unkindly, like a manager confiding an unfortunate fact about policy. Vinny hangs up and realizes he still has to keep moving. Ririn squeezes his hand and asks if they are playing a game. He says yes. He says it like it's rain and not weather. In an alley, they run into Paul. The blocking is coincidence that the film makes feel like fate. He has left the ring early, or perhaps the fight has ended earlier than we know. It doesn't matter. The cut tells us that the only score that matters right now is a small heart beating too fast. They don't waste time on conversation. The three of them practice the choreography of urgency, moving through backyards strung with laundry over low walls that slice jeans, through a garage where a cat watches, wars it's seen before. The men pursue, not running, not shouting, because institutional menace is patient. The camera switches styles here, handheld and close, not to simulate chaos, but to place us within the decision-making of their feet. Paul hasn't thrown a punch outside the ring since the apartment incident, and he tries not to now. He blocks paths, rearranges obstacles, uses inertia as a friend. He knows his most dangerous weapon is the need to protect. He has learned how to temper it. In one shot, he slides a rolling cart into the path of a man with the too small shirt, not as an attack, but as an invitation to trip. In another, he steers Ririn into the crook of his arm and spins her around a pylon like a dance, not as a flourish, but because the shortest path was not the safest. The choreography is understated artistry. Every movement is tailored to a child's center of gravity. Yet, inevitability is a character in Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer, and it is patient. They reach a warehouse line, a series of single-story spaces with rusted shutters and puddles that hold the sky in nervous fragments. A door stands half open in a way that might be a trap or might be mercy. The world pulls a held breath. Vinny looks at Paul with a question he doesn't have language for. Paul nods once, a nod that says, "I will be what I have to be for both of you." The soundtrack withdraws, leaving only the sound of water finding the lowest place. Riren squeezes Paul's wrist twice, a code she invented for "remember the shark who wanted to be a cloud." He smiles, which is perhaps the bravest thing he does in the entire film. Inside the warehouse, darkness is not an absence, but a texture. The camera exposes for silhouettes first, then slowly carves detail out of shadow. A stack of pallets, coiled rope, a ladder with a table of tools that could be used for anything. Space is dangerous here because it makes sound into a map. And when the first voice comes from the far end of the room, it arrives like a stone rolled across a floor. "Paul Harking," Binterta says, not as a greeting, but as a title. Paul steps forward, and the frame holds him in a hall of shadows with edges sharp enough to cut on. He doesn't lift his fists. He drops his hands. The gesture is bigger than surrender. It is an invitation to speak plainly, maybe for the first time in either man's life. Ben is not alone. There is a man with a clipboard because darkness still demands paperwork. There is a woman with a face you might recognize from a cafe at dawn, which makes it worse. There's a white cooler humming softly like a lullaby for things that should not be asleep. The blocking places Riren 2 steps behind, half inside a pocket of shadow, like a thought someone might forget to remember. Vinny is a triangle away, trying to hold all the possible futures in his hands long enough for one to become the present. Ryan arrives last, his shoes never quite dirty in a way that is not an art direction mistake, but a statement. He does not intrude, he evaluates. "Your timing's good," Ryan says, as if reporting on a machine. Paul nods, and in the nod is a complicated goodbye to an entire identity he's had to drag behind him like a damaged limb. The dialogue here is precise because each man is saying things to a room full of instruments. Ben speaks about numbers as if they soothe him. Ryan uses metaphors like invoices. Paul refuses metaphor, as if language itself has conspired against him, and the only way to resist is to be literal. Riren, from her pocket of shadow, says something tiny about her sketchbook, and every adult in the room flinches because innocence is an unwelcome light. The sound stops subtracting and begins to add. We hear a moth burn itself on a fluorescent tube somewhere in the roof. The camera slowly approaches Ben as he tells a story about a boy who needed blood in a town far from here and how his supply chain saved him, as if that absolves the costs. He believes in a machine. He believes in outcomes. He believes harm is acceptable if it can be tallied under saved. His religion is efficiency. And the film lets him be persuasive enough that we feel the tug of his logic. Paul listens with discipline. There are 100 ways this could end. He wants none of them. Yet he knows.
In a world like this, a good ending is not available. There are only less bad ones. When the first step is taken, when a man we haven't noticed steps from behind a pillar with a zip tie in his hand, it's as if a switch has been flipped that controls the flow of time. Paul moves. He doesn't attack the man, he attacks the decision. He steps onto the zip tie's path and lets it catch his wrist, then uses that attachment to pull the man into the light and away from the child. It is ugly and graceful, like all the best problem solving. The choreography refuses to give us satisfaction, it gives us necessity. In the scuffle's rhythm, a figure darts, a small one. Riren, who doesn't run toward a door, but toward a ladder, because in her world, up is always better than out. She climbs into a grid of steel beams where men with big hands cannot follow easily. Paul sees her, and the camera catches that vision, the two of them making a line through space only they can understand. Ben's face remains neutral. Ryan's cracks with something like admiration, as if he is watching an experiment produce unexpected data. Vinny makes a choice that will define him. He puts his back against a door and lifts a pipe he does not know how to use, not to win a fight, but to slow it down. He has always been good at time. He is better now. And then, because the film understands that suspense is oxygen rationing, it gives us a pause so quiet we lean forward unconsciously. Dust floats in an angled shaft of light from a hole in the roof. The cooler hums. The zip tie on Paul's wrist squeaks. He looks up and sees Riren's eyes between two beams, wide and fierce, and too brave. He opens his mouth to say her name, and in that fraction, a hand closes on his shoulder from behind with the speed of a decision we don't get to see, and the screen, for an instant, holds its breath with him. There is a moment early in Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer where the camera holds on a pair of battered hands, knuckles split, veins raised, skin scarred from a lifetime of impact, and the world around them dissolves into a blur of cold neon and passing motorcycle headlights. Those hands tremble as they close around a cheap delivery box, the kind that gets tossed on doorsteps and kicked aside when it rains. The man attached to them used to be a god in the ring. Now he waits on the curb like any other forgotten worker, swallowed by the city's indifference. That man is Paul Harkin, and this is where our journey begins. Welcome to Scenecraft Review, where today we dive deep, painfully, relentlessly deep, into the fractured soul of Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer, a 2026 Indonesian character study disguised as a brutal action drama, and one of those rare films that understands that the most devastating blows are the ones you never see coming. From its opening frame, Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer declares itself as a film obsessed with aftermaths, not the fight, but the echo that rattles the bones after the crowd goes home. The director, Aditya Rendra, doesn't start with a roaring stadium or a triumphant entrance. Instead, he opens with silence, broken only by rain and engine noise, as Paul weaves through Jakarta traffic on an aging scooter, the city lights smearing along his helmet visor. The cinematography by Luvi Darmawan favors long lenses here, flattening the hectic streets into claustrophobic layers of color and motion, as if the city itself is pressing down on Paul's shoulders. The palette is mostly sickly greens and sodium orange reflections on wet asphalt, colors that feel both toxic and tired, mirroring a life that continues out of habit rather than hope. We don't yet know his past. All we feel is weight. The sound design does something quietly brilliant in these first minutes. The low thrum of the bike engine is distant, almost muffled, while the squeal of wet tires, the hiss of bus brakes, and the occasional motorcycle horn slice sharply through the mix. It creates a sense that Paul is drifting slightly out of sync with reality. The world is loud, harsh, buzzing with life, but his presence inside it is muted, like someone listening from behind a wall. The music by composer Rarar Sabaggio does not rush in to guide our feelings. Instead, we get a minimal, almost imperceptible drone, more a vibration than a melody, like the sustained note of a held breath. Rendera is already signaling the film's central preoccupation. This is a story about a man trapped in the moment after an impact, living inside the ringing in his own ears. When Paul finally stops parking his scooter under a leaking awning, the camera cuts in close for the first time, and we meet his face. It's the kind of face that tells stories even when the script is silent. Harkin is played by Donny Alazanai, and this is the performance of his career. His eyes are puffy, but not from tears. They're the eyes of someone who hasn't had a full night's sleep in years. There's a permanent tension in his jaw, like every word he doesn't say is clenched between.
It's breath with him. There is a moment early in Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer where the camera holds on a pair of battered hands, knuckles split, veins raised, skin scarred from a lifetime of impact, and the world around them dissolves into a blur of cold neon and passing motorcycle headlights. Those hands tremble as they close around a cheap delivery box, the kind that gets tossed on doorsteps and kicked aside when it rains. The man attached to them used to be a god in the ring. Now he waits on the curb like any other forgotten worker, swallowed by the city's indifference. That man is Paul Harkin. And this is where our journey begins. Welcome to Scenecraft Review, where today we dive deep, painfully, relentlessly deep into the fractured soul of Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer, a 2026 Indonesian character study disguised as a brutal action drama and one of those rare films that understands that the most devastating blows are the ones you never see coming. From its opening frame, Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer declares itself as a film obsessed with aftermaths. Not the fight, but the echo that rattles the bones after the crowd goes home. The director, Aditya Rendra, doesn't start with a roaring stadium or a triumphant entrance. Instead, he opens with silence, broken only by rain and engine noise as Paul weaves through Jakarta traffic on an aging scooter, the city lights smearing along his helmet visor. The cinematography by Luvi Darmawan favors long lenses here, flattening the hectic streets into claustrophobic layers of color and motion, as if the city itself is pressing down on Paul's shoulders. The palette is mostly sickly greens and sodium orange reflections on wet asphalt, colors that feel both toxic and tired, mirroring a life that continues out of habit rather than hope. We don't yet know his past. All we feel is weight. The sound designed as something quietly brilliant in these first minutes. The low thrum of the bike engine is distant, almost muffled, while the SCO is pressing down on Paul's shoulders. The palette is mostly sickly greens and sodium orange reflections on wet asphalt, colors that feel both toxic and tired, mirroring a life that continues out of habit rather than hope. We don't yet know his past. All we feel is weight. The sound designed as something quietly brilliant in these first minutes. The low thrum of the bike engine is distant, almost muffled, while the squeal of wet tires, the hiss of bus brakes, and the occasional motorcycle horn slice sharply through the mix. It creates a sense that Paul is drifting slightly out of sync with reality. The world is loud, harsh, buzzing with life. But his presence inside it is muted, like someone listening from behind a wall. The music by composer Warsabejo does not rush in to guide our feelings. Instead, we get a minimal, almost imperceptible drone, more a vibration than a melody, like the sustained note of a held breath. Rendera is already signaling the film's central preoccupation. This is a story about a man trapped in the moment after an impact, living inside the ringing in his own ears. When Paul finally stops, parking his scooter under a leaking awning, the camera cuts in close for the first time and we meet his face. It's the kind of face that tells stories even when the script is silent. Harkin is played by Donnie Allardyce, and this is the performance of his career. His eyes are puffy but not from tears. They're the eyes of someone who hasn't had a full night's sleep in years. There's a permanent tension in his jaw. Like every word he doesn't say is clenched between his teeth. Underneath the helmet, the gray streaks in his hair add a fragile dignity. But the film doesn't romanticize his aging. You see the sun damage, the broken nose that never healed quite right, the uneven skin tone of a man who's spent too long under arena lights and fluorescent gym bulbs. The camera lingers on him without cutting away. And in that unwavering gaze, we begin to sense what caught up and flash of violence, but it's not a punch. It's a memory. A hard cut drops us into the past, and suddenly the color palette bursts into life. The sequence has an almost feverish vibrancy. Saturated crimsons, electric blues, golden highlights. We're in a packed kickboxing arena and the sound is overwhelming. Crowd chants pulse in unison. The commentary blare in bara from tiny loudspeakers. Camera flashes strobe the ring in disorienting bursts. The editing becomes hyperkinetic here, but what's important is where the camera chooses to place us. We're not seeing Paul as a distant figure in the ring, the way television would frame him. Instead, we're almost at skin level. Sweat flies toward the lens. Gloves collide just inches from our point of view. In those collisions, Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer reveals its first major thematic axis. The film is fundamentally about contact, bodies meeting, lives colliding, consequences shattering in waves that extend far beyond the point of impact. Paul in this Flashback is almost unrecognizable compared to the weary courier we met. His hair is darker, his body leaner, his posture loaded with confidence. Alferes calibrates his performance with surgical precision here. It's not simply that younger Paul smiles more. It's that his entire face is looser, his gestures more expansive. There's a careless swagger to how he moves between rounds, to the way he glances at the audience, responding to the roar like a musician to applause. We feel how intoxicating that adoration must be. Rendera and Thermon give this fight a mythic sheen. The lighting is almost unreal. Beams of white slicing down from overhead, making the ring look like an altar. The ropes glow against the darkness of the stands, and Paul stands at the center, anointed by light. In the sound mix, the impact of each kick is exaggerated slightly, reverberating like cannon fire, turning Paul's body into a weaponized instrument. But Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer isn't content to simply glow. Kick is exaggerated slightly, reverberating like cannon fire, turning Paul's body into a weaponized instrument. But Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer isn't content to simply glorify the spectacle. Even in this triumphant moment, there are fractures. Between exchanges, the camera cuts not to the cheering fans, but to quick intimate glimpses of the people closest to Paul. We see his wife, Diet, in the front row. Her expression, a complex blend of pride and anxiety. A tightness around the mouth that never relaxes even when he lands a clean shot. Beside her sits a little girl, maybe 8 years old. His daughter, wearing oversized headphones to protect her ears from the noise. She clutches a handmade sign with his name, the letters decorated with glitter and tiny drawings of boxing gloves. Her eyes are huge, reflecting the arena lights with a wonder that feels almost sacred. The way the camera observes her is different than anything else in the scene. Soft focus, slightly slower motion, as if the world slows down around her. Even before the script reveals what will happen, we understand she is the emotional nucleus of Paul's existence. Overlaying this sensory rush is the first seed of the film's central tragedy. The commentary mentions almost in passing that this could be Paul Harkin's last fight before going international, that scouts from foreign promotions are watching. It's framed as an incredible opportunity. Jakarta's own undefeated champion on the verge of global legend. But the way the camera cuts from this line to a close-up of Da anxiously twisting a ring on her finger tells us something darker. Success is not benign. It will ask for something in return. And in Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer, every victory comes with a hidden cost paid in flesh. The shape of that cost begins to reveal itself not through the violence of the ring, but through the insidious violence of it. After a spectacular finishing combination captured in one of the film's most kinetic sequences, it's the sort of pure adrenaline cinema that could have been ripped straight from a conventional sports film. But Aditya Rendra refuses to let the high last. Almost immediately, Paul's posture shifts. His breathing becomes erratic. The light, confident swagger drains away, replaced by a creeping disorientation. The camera starts to tilt ever so slightly out of level, giving us a subconscious sense that reality is slanting sideways. Darwin switches from crisp, steady ring photography to handheld close-ups that shake just enough to register distress without becoming chaotic. We move into Paul's point of view. The bright white overhead lights flare into painful halos. The faces in the crowd blur, and the roar of the arena warps into a low, submerged rumble. The sound design here is almost horror-like. The outside world recedes, replaced by the thunder of Paul's own heartbeat and a strange, eerie, high-pitched whine like tinnitus turned into a weapon. His vision narrows into a tunnel, and the edges of the frame darken. Alfer's performance shifts with frightening speed. His bravado melts into vulnerability, and for a split second, he looks like a lost child in an adult body, gasping for air. In a place where oxygen suddenly feels in short supply, backstage chaos erupts. In the cramped concrete corridors beneath the arena, fluorescent lights flicker overhead as medics swarm around Paul. The palette here strips down to harsh whites and grays, washing the world of the saturated, glorified hues of the ring. It feels like a fall from Olympus into some bureaucratic underworld. Voices shout over each other, but Rendra keeps us tethered to Paul's subjective experience. The doctor's questions, "Did you hit your head? Can you see my fingers?" are muffled as if spoken underwater. His team argues with event officials about something we don't fully hear. It's here in the background of this confusion that a single sinister detail emerges. Someone unseen retrieving a discarded water bottle, slipping it into a plastic bag. The camera doesn't underline it with a zoom. It simply registers it and moves on. The seed of the poison is planted almost the way poison itself operates in the narrative, quietly, invisibly transforming the entire organism before anyone realizes. The storytelling genius of Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer is that it never treats the poisoning as just a plot twist or a cheap inciting incident. Instead, it fuses that violation into Paul's entire psychological landscape. This isn't just a man who is cheated out of a win. This is a man whose identity as untouchable was shattered not by a stronger fighter, but by an act of cowardice that collapses the moral code he built his life around. The very idea of fighting, of two people meeting in a ring with rules and risk, is betrayed. In his mind, the poison does more than make him lose. It corrupts the sanctity of the fight itself. That's important because Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer is not simply about revenge against whoever spiked that bottle. It's about what happens when the sacred rules that defined your life turn out to be lies and you have to live with the fallout. But before Paul can even begin to process this existential rupture, the film slams him and us into an even greater catastrophe. After the fight, after the shaky post-match interviews where he stumbles through and answers in front of cameras that now see him less as a god and more as a wounded animal, we find him in a dimly lit parking structure. The coolness of the concrete, the echo of his footsteps, the sharp metallic clack of his gear bag again. Armin Praso, a fighter he just defeated, played with simmering intensity by reason. Ammon's face is a swollen roadmap of fresh bruises and old scars, but his eyes are fiercely alive. He is surrounded by a small entourage, trainers, hangers-on, the kind of aggressive, hungry faces that orbit men like him. The blocking of the scene is masterful. The two fighters stand at opposite sides of a concrete pillar, circling it like planets pulled by mutual gravity. For a moment, Armin's posture suggests reluctant respect. He raises a hand as if to offer a shake. Then the dialogue undercuts that gesture. His words drip with accusation, suggesting that Paul's victory wasn't clean, hinting that perhaps Paul was the beneficiary of illegal tactics. In a bitter irony, the man poisoned now stands accused of cheating. The script is already weaving together themes of perception and reality. How stories about honoring combat are written not by truth, but by whoever shouts loudest. Paul's response is not diplomatic. Tension that's been building in him since his collapse explodes. The camera moves closer. The parking structure's overhead lights, creating harsh shadows under their brows, making both men look more animal and human. There is no referee here, no rules, just raw wounded ego scraping against concrete. When Armin's entourage surrounds Paul, jostling him, calling him a fraud, the choreography shifts from stylized combat to something uglier, more spontaneous. Punches are thrown, but they lack the elegance of the ring. They are messy, fueled by fear and humiliation. One of the film's most brilliant choices is to stage this fight not in the center of the frame, but partially obscured by parked cars and pillars. We glimpse limbs, hear grunts, see flashes of movement. The violence becomes less spectacle, more intrusion. We feel like we're spying on something that shouldn't be happening. Into this volatile moment, the film inserts innocence. Paul's daughter, who had slipped away contrasts sharply with the ragged breathing and scuffling from the fight. The camera alternates between long shots of her approaching, oblivious, and cramped close-ups of fists and faces. There's a particular shot, a low angle from behind her, the chaos of the brawl framed between the tires of a parked car. That encapsulates the film's devastating thesis. In a world built on violence, the innocent are always in the crossfire, even when they don't yet understand the rules of the game. The fatal moment itself is staged with almost unbearable restraint. There is no slow motion, no dramatic musical cue. It happens in real time with the frightening speed of real accidents. Armin shoves Paul. Paul stumbles back, instinctively swings to keep distance, his arm smashing into a metal trolley loaded with equipment. That trolley, which the camera barely registered in earlier shots, now becomes a horrible instrument as it hurtles away. Wheels squealing on the concrete. It collides with a stack of crates. Those crates topple. One of them, heavy and unsecured, falls from just the wrong height at just the wrong angle. The camera doesn't follow the crate. It stays for a beat on Paul's face as he hears his daughter's voice call his name. Then a sickening thud. A gas that's cut short. The crowd's echo is gone. There is only silence. What follows is one of the most harrowing sequences in contemporary Indonesian cinema. The sound drops out almost completely. We don't even get the expected crescendo of a tragic score. Instead, we experience the moment through a kind of sensory void. Paul turns and the frame seems to hesitate as if the film itself doesn't want to show us what he's about to see. When it finally does, it is not gratuitous. The little girl lies pinned under a crate, a small trickle of blood arcing from her forehead, her sign crushed. Beside her, DA's scream rips through the parking structure, and in a brilliant sound design choice, it arrives slightly delayed, like someone turned. Beside her, DA's scream rips through the parking structure, and in a brilliant sound design choice, it arrives slightly delayed, like someone turned up the volume on reality half a second too late. That fractional disconnect makes the horror feel even more surreal. Time doesn't slow down, it collapses, pooling into a single image Paul will never escape. Alfer's performance here is almost physically painful to watch. His body convulses between action and paralysis. The instinct to lift the crate battles with the knowledge that any movement could make things worse. And that war plays out in the micro muscles of his arms and shoulders. When he finally drops to his knees beside his daughter, the way his hands hover over her, trembling inches from contact, is more eloquent than any line of dialogue could ever be. He is a man whose entire life has been about impact, suddenly terrified to touch the thing he loves most. The cinematography mirrors this internal war with tight, fragmented close-ups. His fingers, her hair tangled over concrete. Diet's shaking lips, refusing to give us the relief of a single composed shot. The camera itself seems to be in shock, trying and failing to process the magnitude of what has happened. In the aftermath of this accident, Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer makes a storytelling choice that defines its entire emotional trajectory. It does not immediately cut to a funeral. It does not skip ahead to some later stage of grief. Instead, it lingers in the roar, confusing in between hospitals, paperwork, police questions, accusatory glances from bystanders. We see Paul in a harshly lit hallway, his hand still stained with his daughter's blood as officers ask him to clarify the sequence of events. One of them raises the possibility of negligence. Another suggests Armin provoked the confrontation. But what the film emphasizes is not the legal blame game. It's the way every word, every question, every form stamped and signed feels like a chisel etching. Hospital room. We see her sitting beside their daughter's bed, her back a rigid line of refusal. Paul stands in the doorway, a shadow split by the vertical bars of the window frame, visually imprisoned by his own guilt. He tries to speak. Alferes lets his lips tremble around unformed words, but nothing coherent emerges. When De finally does address him, her voice is hoarse, almost a whisper. "You always said you could control the damage." It's a simple line, but it carries years of resentment and unspoken fear. She doesn't yell. She doesn't need to. The way she refuses to look at him while saying it is enough. We understand without the script needing to spell it out that this accident didn't happen in a vacuum. It's the culmination of a lifetime of compromises, warnings ignored, boundaries pushed. Cinematically, the film begins to shift into a colder, more distant mode during this chapter. The warm tones of the ring are gone. Even the sickly greens of the city at night have given way to an almost clinical blue-gray. Hospital corridors, empty. Apartments, anonymous offices, the spaces Paul inhabits now are lit with flat, unforgiving light that drains the color from everything, including his skin. The camera frequently frames him alone in the shot, even when there are other people nearby. There's a particularly striking image of him standing at the far end of a long hallway while DA signs discharge paperwork for their daughter's body. The depth of field is so shallow that only her pen and the form are in focus. Paul is a blurred silhouette at the edge of comprehension. It's as if he's already slipping out of the world of the living, becoming a ghost in his own life. The funeral, when it finally arrives, is not staged as a melodramatic centerpiece, but as a fragmented collection of impressions. Hands tossing earth onto a coffin. A girl's photograph propped against flowers. Raindrops crawling down an umbrella surface. The camera rarely shows Paul's face fully here. Instead, large to be contained by a single shot, the sound remains relatively subdued. A few whispered prayers, the soft thump of soil. Somewhere in the distant city, traffic hums indifferent. Life goes on, the film suggests, and that continuation is both a comfort and an obscenity. In the days that follow, Paul's life implodes quietly but decisively. The media, hungry for a tragic angle, digs into the parking structure incident. Grainy phone videos surface online, showing the altercation with Armin, edited and re-edited to emphasize Paul's role in the chaos. Headlines reduce a complex tragedy into clickable narratives. Champion's rage leads to daughter's death. Poisoned fighter snaps. After loss. The irony, of course, is that the initial injustice, the poisoning, remains unproven, almost an afterthought. Public perception hardens swiftly. Sponsors distance themselves. Fight promoters cancel future bouts. Friends stop calling. The film doesn't give us a montage of these rejections. Instead, it folds them into the texture of Paul's daily existence. A stack of unopened letters, his phone lighting up, with notifications from anonymous accounts spewing blame. A once busy gym now eerily quiet as clients cancel sessions one by one. One scene stands out as the emotional nadir of this descent. Paul returns to the gym where he trained for years, hoping perhaps to find some solace in routine. The space is bathed in cool morning light, filtering through dusty windows, illuminating the floating mows like a constellation of tiny ghosts. He moves through the equipment like someone navigating a museum of their former life. Punching bags hang silent there, surfaces bearing the imprints of his hands from countless hours. The ring in the center of the room, once the site of his self-creation, looks strangely small now, diminished without the surrounding energy of crowds and lights. When he climbs between the ropes, the boards creak under his weight, and, for a second, we think he might start shadow. When he climbs between the ropes, the boards creak under his weight, and, for a second, we think he might start shadow. Boxing attempt to reclaim some fragment of his old self. Instead, he just stands there looking down at the canvas. The camera adopts a slow, circling dolly movement, not the dynamic sweep used during actual fights, but something more ghostly, as if orbiting a collapsed star. The gym's owner, who used to be his coach, emerges from the office. Their conversation is brief, painfully awkward. He doesn't shout. He doesn't overtly condemn Paul. But the message is clear. Insurance problems, bad press, nervous clients. Paul's presence is a liability. Now, the implicit accusation is not that he killed his daughter intentionally, but that violence follows him, that he's a magnet for catastrophe. There's a loaded moment where the coach mentions in a halting voice that parents have been asking if it's safe for their kids to train here with Paul around. The idea shatters him more than any insult could. The role of menace to children. doesn't fit the narrative he had of himself as a father and protector. The film holds on his reaction, letting us see the exact instant his last tether to his old identity snaps. From there, Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer accelerates Paul's fall into ordinary anonymity. We learn through carefully placed visual details rather than expositional dialogue that Da has left, taking whatever remained of their shared life with her. Their apartment, once subtly warm and cluttered with signs of a child, crayons, school books, tiny shoes by the door, is now stripped down to a bare impersonal space. A mattress on the floor, a few dishes in the sink, a single photo face down on a table. We never see the full image in this part of the film. The camera teases it with partial glimpses, as if Paul can't bring himself to look directly at the evidence of the family he destroyed. Bills pile up. Training no longer pays. In a quietly humiliating sequence. 3 a.m. and hold you by the throat. This transition into the gig economy is not just a plot mechanism. It's a thematic masterstroke. By dropping a fallen champion into the unglamorous world of app-driven precarious labor, the film draws a parallel between two different forms of bodily exploitation. In the ring, Paul sold his body as entertainment, taking damage in exchange for glory and money. As a courier, he sells it for convenience, enduring heat, exhaustion, and risk for the comfort of faceless customers. The difference is that in the ring, the violence had rules and witnesses. On the road, the danger is diffuse, constant, no longer framed as heroism. The cinematography leans into this dramatization. Relic streets, endless traffic jams, the gray monotony of concrete flyovers. These become Paul's new arena. But there is no roaring crowd, only the impersonal ping of delivery notifications. It's in this phase of the film that we begin to sense another narrative thread quietly weaving itself into Paul's orbit. The lives of Vinnie Jenner and his daughter ruin. The introduction of Vinnie is a fascinating tonal pivot. We first see him not through his own eyes, but through ruins. The camera adopts a lower angle, the world framed at child height, making everything from kitchen counters to adult arguments loom just a bit too large. Ririn, played by young newcomer Karana Olia, is immediately compelling. There is a seriousness in her gaze that doesn't feel precocious in the annoying move way, but rather like a child who has had to learn to read the room for danger. She watches her father with wary affection, cataloging his moods, sensing undercurrents he thinks she doesn't notice. Vinnie, portrayed by Rio Dewanto with a mix of charm and exhaustion, is not introduced as a saint. We find him in a cramped auto repair workshop, hands deep in an engine bay, arguing on the phone with someone about payments overdue. The space is cluttered, oil-stained, alive with the metal. Played with chilling restraint by Ario Bayou, Ryan is the kind of antagonist who never raises his voice because he doesn't need to. The power he wields is structural, not physical. The blocking in their first interaction says everything. Ryan stands in the sunlight, his suit catching every ray while Vinnie remains half in shadow, squinting up from the darkness of the garage. The power dynamic is clear. Their conversation is superficially polite, banter about car parts and business, but under the surface, it's all threat. Ryan reminds Vinnie of agreements of support provided when Vinnie needed it, of debts that have to be paid. The dialogue never explicitly says loan shark or organized crime, but the implication hangs heavy in the air, thick as engine smoke. The mention of Ririn's rare blood type, Rhesus negative, enters the story almost casually at first in a doctor's office scene that precedes this confrontation. Ririn sits on the exam table, swinging her legs, while a weary pediatrician explains to Vinnie that her blood is extremely rare in the local population, something to be mindful of in emergencies. The doctor's tone is factual, even reassuring, but the film subtly darkens the moment with choices in framing and sound. The clock on the wall ticks a bit louder than it should. The fluorescent overhead light flickers once. A gust of wind slams a window somewhere in the building, making Ruin flinch. The idea is planted. This blood is special. And in a world where bodies are commodities, nothing special remains safely sacred for long. Ririn herself is portrayed with a fragile resilience that becomes the moral counterpoint to Paul's broken masculinity. She draws quietly at the side of the workshop, more comfortable in oil and dust than in classrooms we never see. Her drawings, which the camera lingers on, often depict figures standing alone in wide empty spaces, bridges, roads, riversides, as if she instinctively understands solitude even at her age. In one drawing. Yet, when the camera drops back down to street level, those same vehicles become loaded with meaning. Their trajectories, bearing the weight of individual choices, accidents, guilt, and desperation. The moment Paul's and Ruin's paths finally cross is staged with an almost mystical subtlety. It's late evening. Rain, of course, because this film uses weather not as decorative mood, but as emotional punctuation. Paul pulls up to a dilapidated apartment block to drop off a package. The building's corridor is dimly lit, the fluorescent tubes buzzing faintly, plaster appealing from walls. As he waits for the door to open, the camera lingers on his posture, slightly hunched, shoulders damp, helmet still on like a barrier between him and the world. Down the corridor, a small figure appears barefoot, chasing a cheap plastic ball that's rolled away from a half-open door. It's Ririn. The ball bumps against Paul's boot. He looks down. For a moment, all we see of her is the top of her wet hair, droplets clinging to the strands like tiny jewels. When she looks up, their eyes meet. Rendera shoots this encounter in a close-up that feels almost invasive in its intimacy. The background melts into soft blur. The only things in focus are Paul's weathered face and Ruin's searching gaze. There's a flicker of recognition that neither of them can fully articulate. For Ruin, perhaps it's the unconscious recognition of the man from her drawing, the lonely figure on the motorcycle. For Paul, it's something deeper, more primal, a jolt of memory as he sees in her face an echo of the daughter he lost. The resemblance is not literal. The casting doesn't go for cheap doubling. Instead, it's something about the way her lower lip trembles when she's anxious. The way her eyes dart sideways when adults are tense. Alpha Eyes lets a micro-expression cross his face in that instant. Something between awe and terror. As if the universe has played a cruel trick on him by sending him this reminder. Vinny App. Barefoot in the hall. The dynamic here is crucial. Vinny is not an abusive father, but he is a distracted one, pulled between economic survival and parenting. His love for Ririn is clear, but so is his fear. A fear made sharper by the knowledge of her fragile blood. As the door closes, Ruin looks back one more time at Paul. The camera follows. That look, staying with him for a beat longer as his gaze lingers on the now closed door. He doesn't know yet how entangled their futures will become. But something in his posture as he walks away has changed. For the first time in a long while, his body seems just a tiny bit less heavy, as if that brief contact with innocence with possibility has slightly altered his gravitational center. Of course, in the moral universe of Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer, moments of grace do not arrive unaccompanied. The very same night, we see Ryan in a high-end restaurant, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline. The environment is a stark contrast to the cramped apartments and oil-stained workshops we've seen. The lighting here is warm, flattering. Everything designed to make the patrons feel important and insulated from the world's harsher edges. Ryan sits across from another man, older, pale, obviously unwell. Oxygen tubes snake into his nose. This is Ben Turda, a name that has floated on the fringes of the story, but now materializes in flesh. Ben is played by Slamet Rajo in a late career performance that exudes both menace and decay. He is the puppet master whose strings run under the city's surface, connecting everything from construction deals to organ trafficking and now potentially to a little girl's rare blood. Their conversation shot in medium close-ups that emphasize the intimate brutality of power revolves around medical charts. Ben's illness is serious, his body failing him. A liver transplant is mentioned, complications, rejection. But what catches our ear is a single phrase from TH. Barefoot in the hall. The dynamic here is crucial. Vinny is not an abusive father, but he is a distracted one, pulled between economic survival and parenting. His love for Ririn is clear, but so is his fear. A fear made sharper by the knowledge of her fragile blood. As the door closes, Ruin looks back one more time at Paul. The camera follows. That look, staying with him for a beat longer as his gaze lingers on the now closed door. He doesn't know yet how entangled their futures will become. But something in his posture as he walks away has changed. For the first time in a long while, his body seems just a tiny bit less heavy, as if that brief contact with innocence with possibility has slightly altered his gravitational center. Of course, in the moral universe of Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer, moments of grace do not arrive unaccompanied. The very same night, we see Ryan in a high-end restaurant, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline. The environment is a stark contrast to the cramped apartments and oil-stained workshops we've seen. The lighting here is warm, flattering. Everything designed to make the patrons feel important and insulated from the world's harsher edges. Ryan sits across from another man, older, pale, obviously unwell. Oxygen tubes snake into his nose. This is Ben Turda, a name that has floated on the fringes of the story, but now materializes in flesh. Ben is played by Slamet Rajo in a late career performance that exudes both menace and decay. He is the puppet master whose strings run under the city's surface, connecting everything from construction deals to organ trafficking and now potentially to a little girl's rare blood. Their conversation shot in medium close-ups that emphasize the intimate brutality of power revolves around medical charts. Ben's illness is serious, his body failing him. A liver transplant is mentioned, complications, rejection. But what catches our ear is a single phrase from TH. Brutality of power revolves around medical charts. Ben's illness is serious, his body failing him. A liver transplant is mentioned, complications, rejection. But what catches our ear is a single phrase from the doctor's report that Ryan quotes severe complications due to rare blood type requirements. Donor compatibility extremely limited. In Ben's world, limitations are simply problems waiting for a sufficient quantity of money and violence to solve. The idea that his biology might defy his wealth enrages him. Slamet plays this with a terrifying stillness. His voice doesn't rise. His face doesn't contort. Only his eyes harden and one hand tightens ever so slightly around the stem of his wine glass until a thin crack appears in the crystal. The symbolism is unsubtle but perfectly calibrated, a fragile container full of rich red liquid under invisible pressure. Somewhere in the flow of this conversation, Ryan mentions with studied casualness the existence of a resource in the city, a child with the extremely rare blood type that could potentially match Ben's needs, or at the very least be monetized in some black market capacity. The script is KY about the specifics at this stage, and that ambiguity is part of its power. Are they planning to harvest Ruin's blood for transfusions? To use her as a living donor for someone else in Ben's circle to sell her to a foreign buyer with even fewer scruples? The film doesn't articulate it yet, and that lack of clarity mirrors the way evil often operates, not as fully formed plans, but as hungry intentions circling around vulnerable lives. As Ryan slides a thin folder across the table containing, we suspect, the first scraps of information that will lead him to Vinny and Ririn, the camera pushes in on his face. For the first time, we see a crack in his composure. It's not guilt. It's something more like weariness. We sense that even he understands the enormity of what he is setting in motion. Yet he does it anyway because in this world, empathy is a luxury reserved for those not trapped in the machinery of survival and ambition. Ryan is as much a product of that machinery as Paul or Vinny, but he has chosen to ride it to the top rather than be ground beneath it. His moral compromises are colder, more calculated. But they share the same route with Paul's, a belief that violence, if controlled and contained, can be a tool rather than a poison. Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer will spend the rest of its runtime dismantling that illusion for every character who holds it. Paul, oblivious to these illuminations, continues his grim routine. Yet that brief encounter with Ruin plants a splinter in his psyche. In subsequent scenes, as he navigates the city, he begins to notice children more often, a girl skipping rope on a sidewalk, a boy trying to sell tissues at a traffic light. The film doesn't sentimentalize these images. It doesn't turn Paul into some saintly observer redeemed by mere proximity to youth. Instead, it shows how each glimpse is both a balm and a wound, a reminder of what is lost and a faint, terrifying suggestion that he might still have something to offer another life. The score reflects this inner turbulence. Subtle, hesitant melodic fragments begin to emerge from the ambient droning soundscape. Tiny motifs on piano and gamelan that never quite resolve, like a question asked but never answered. One particularly striking sequence finds Paul taking a delivery that brings him by coincidence or fate back into Vinny's orbit. This time the destination is not the apartment, but the workshop. It's late. The place is mostly closed, shut a half down. A single overhead bulb casting a degraded yellow cone onto the oily floor. Inside, Vinny is alone working on a car with an intensity that borders on desperation. Papers lie scattered on a nearby table. Unpaid bills. Bank notices. A hastily scribbled reminder about her meeting with Ryan. Ririn curls on a plastic chair in the corner. Half ASL. Gaze. Ririn looks up from her coloring book, sleepy eyes meeting his again. The TV in the background shows a kickboxing match for a moment. Archive footage of a younger Paul, arms raised in victory. Ruin tilts her head trying to connect the figure on the screen with the man in front of her. The juxtaposition is almost surreal. Past glory projected in washed-out colors behind present wreckage. The film allows this moment to hang without comment, trusting the audience to feel the weight of that visual coincidence. It is as if the ghosts of Paul's former self are intruding upon this fragile new possibility. The hand is not angry. It is administrative. Fingers settle on Paul's trapezius with the confidence of someone used to finishing sentences other people began. And the grip says, we could end you or we could guide you. And both options are equally available. The camera doesn't jump. It pivots as if reluctant to grant this new presence the dignity of surprise. A profile comes into view. A man whose haircut is an apology for nothing. Whose scar tissue is a thin seam at the base of the ring finger. The kind of mark that tells a story about a door slammed too quickly or a job done in the dark. Paul's shoulder rolls under. That hand with the instinct of a house remembering an old earthquake. And the choreography here is a hymn to economy. He doesn't snap or break. He shifts weight, rotates just enough to loosen the anchor, lets the grip slide to a sleeve, then traps the wrist against his own chest as if he's hugging a ghost. The movement is so controlled the scene barely ripples. And yet in its quiet math, you can feel the stakes roar. Up. In the rafters, rain changes the axis of the scene. The lighting flips from floor practicals to the soft spill that bleeds through the roof slats. And suddenly, the warehouse is a stratified ecosystem. The lower world belongs to men who fill forms and carry blades. The upper belongs to a child who knows that. Sometimes the only way to stay. In the rafters, rain changes the axis of the scene. The lighting flips from floor practicals to the soft spill that bleeds through the roof slats. And suddenly, the warehouse is a stratified ecosystem. The lower world belongs to men who fill forms and carry blades. The upper belongs to a child who knows that. Sometimes the only way to stay alive is to be where they forget to look. She wasn't taught park hour. She learned. Balance standing on chair backs to reach cabinets where crayons live. The camera shifts focus to catch the grain of the beam under her hands. Her fingers split a tiny half moon of dirt under a nail like a badge. When she moves, it's a whisper. Below, Paul calculates distances the way fighters do with the eyes first and the spine second. He gives ground without ceding space, his body angling so that every pursuit line has to pass through him before it can bend toward the ladder. Ben doesn't bark commands. He watches with the air of a conductor who enjoys the tempo of a piece he didn't have to rehearse. And it's here that the acting digs in. The man's mouth barely moves, his lower lip resting against the ghost of a smile that isn't. His eyes don't shine. They dull as he thinks. Ryan, in contrast, resists involvement with a performance of disengaged authority that feels like a cologne present, crafted and intended to mask. He folds his hands like a banker in a meeting and tracks the variables, not the people, Paul's stamina, Vinny's improvisations, the warehouse's exits, the likelihood of mess that costs money. There's a gorgeous insert of Ryan's jaw tightening for one breath and then settling, the camera catching a flash of vulnerability that he extinguishes the way a man closes a window against weather he disapproves of. The sound palette hovers at the edge of audibility in these moments, the way a room does when it knows it's being listened to. The cooler's lower lays a baseline under everything, a metaphor you can almost touch. Cold, functional, pointed away from throats. And then Ben speaks not to command but to narrate his worldview in a way that invites consent by making dissent feel irrational. We don't hunt, we manage, he says, and the sentence feels like a line item. He asks for the child to come down so that the conversation can begin in sincerity. And the mix gives his voice a tiny bit of room reverb, just enough to echo in the corners. The script does something elegant here. It lets him be articulate. His belief is coherent. He believes the system is a body and he is a doctor who can tolerate necessary pain. The camera refuses to make him the devil we can hate lazily. It keeps him human, which is more frightening because humans build systems that live longer than they do. Vinny has never been a man for speeches. He acts and his action is petty and perfect. He steps sideways as if to reach for Ruin's dropped sweater and instead finds the plug that feeds the fridge of collected blood. His fingers hover for a fraction because even in panic, he understands the arithmetic of consequences. He pulls. The note under the room dies. It's such a small sound, the end of refrigeration. And in that vacuum, the film conjures the poetry of the banal. Ben's head turns by a few degrees, the way a hawk registers an anomaly in its field. No one rushes. Everyone calculates. The temperature doesn't change yet, but the idea of warmth floods the space and it feels like a revolution. In another movie, this would signal heroism. Here, it triggers a new negotiation. Ryan's eyebrows lift by 0.5 millimeter, an expression somewhere between annoyance and interest. He pivots smoothly into policy. He notes that tampering with stored supplies threatens the innocence far from this room. The language draped in philanthropic lacquer. Paul meets the rhetoric with a stare so direct the shot almost flinches. There's a cut quick, almost subliminal to his fists being taped in the locker room to a loop not on the string of his daughter's L. Generate capital with his body, and they will leave the child uncounted. The proposition is obscene because it is viable. Ben doesn't reject it on moral grounds. He rejects it because markets like his don't accept substitutions. The efficiency of his no is the film's wound. The color temp in the scene slides microscopically toward cool again as the stalemate congeals. It's an almost physiological response, a visual shiver. Face is pale, not with fear exactly, but with the awareness that everyone is at the edge of what they can justify. The light that touches Ruin is kinder, a spill from the skylight that gives her skin its own argument, not a symbol, a person. She shifts to a beam closer to the glass. And, because the stakes are no longer theoretical, the editor allows time to breathe. 2 steps, a stretch, a crampon improvisation with sneakers that have no tread left. Her weight settles. The roof panel complains. Outside, there's a hint of life. A motorcycle somewhere, a dog that can't commit to a bark, a delivery truck that idles and then decides to move. Those noises skim the wall of the warehouse like birds unable to enter. Yet, they somehow tilt the angle of everything. Inside, the coiled rope on the table looks suddenly like a lifeline and not an object. The ladder that got her up there looks rickety, now hypothetically heroic. The camera checks in with Vinny. His face is a calculus of damage. The weird calm of a man whose worst fears have all turned into a to-do list. He flicks his gaze from plug to cooler to ruin. And in that triangle is an ethics dissertation more lucid than any speech. Ben palms his coin the same plain disc that has been his nervous system song all film long. And here it flips not as flourish, but as ritual. The sound is louder than before, not because the coin is different, but because our ears have been trained. The flip pulls all eyes, including ours, into a tiny circle of spinning metal that pretends to conjure fate. The camera takes one. Decisions sometimes stretch when they should snap. He catches it without looking. He doesn't reveal it. He pockets it. The refusal to consult chance after performing the gesture of it is the clearest thesis he'll ever utter. He does not leave outcomes to air. A man at the edge of frame decides to be useful and lunges toward the ladder to yank it away from the beam. The movement is hurried, almost anxious to impress. Paul steps into him, the geometry so tight the bodies might be one for a second, and uses the man's arm like a lever, twisting him to the ground. With a technique born of 1,000 drilled repetitions. It's not pretty. It compresses violence into control. The thud is wet and honest. The camera doesn't linger on pain. It moves on because dignity demands we don't harvest suffering for spectacle. Ririn has one hand on the skylight latch now, rust flakes dusting her wrist like an afterthought. We get a flashback inserted like a heartbeat. Paul kneeling in the temple compound among the flags. Ririn braiding a strip of cloth around his finger, whispering that the shark wanted to be a cloud because up there nobody sees teeth. In that gentle metanany, the film embeds a philosophy. Escape by transformation rather than by speed. Back in the present, he looks up and doesn't tell her to jump. He knows better. He says, soft and clear, count it. And it's a callback to a training idea we didn't realize had been planted. The count that keeps fear from becoming time itself. She nods, lips moving with numbers. Radiant concentration making a saint of her for 2 seconds. Ryan interjects as if he's attending to the minutes in a boardroom agenda. He reminds Ben that this show of force is already expensive. He suggests leveraging Paul's offer. Accept the fights. Keep the child flagged. Defer the harvest. The language is chilling in its ballady. The brilliant choice in performance is the way Ryan almost sounds reasonable. The way his tone hints at a compromise that isn't. As character. Vinny, meanwhile, chooses pettiness again because pettiness is sometimes revolution's best tool in rooms like these. He kicks the cooler. Not to dent it, but to wobble the contents to threaten to ruin a batch with agitation. The sound is an insult. Ben tilts his head. For the first time, a hint of temper colors his voice, not loud, stern, like stripes painted on a road. He tells Vinny to stop. Vinny does not. He nudges it again, and a bag thumps inside, red against white, a grotesque heart, asking to be noticed. The film doesn't cut inside the cooler. It refuses us that carnival. It lets us imagine the slump and the slosh, because imagination can be crueler than imagery if you believe in people. There's a small, quiet cut that moves us out of the room for a blink. An exterior shot of the warehouse skin, corrugated metal scored with age, a graffiti tag that looks like a question mark half erased by rain. This breath of outside lightens the room we return to by contrast and gives us a measurement. The world is big and the crimes in it are often small, terrible rooms. Back inside, Paul knows the next move will set the tone for everything that follows. He draws closer to the ladder, but his motion is a veil. The real act is a slide of his foot under a coil he pulls toward the base. He doesn't line up a trip. He strings a barrier that when tensioned will snap against ankles with a sting that disrupts Thor. Because in fights like this, Thor is an opponent. The score whispers a low drone that feels less like music and more like a body humming, with adrenaline. And the cinematography indulges in a brief, gorgeous flourish. A rack focus from the frayed rope fibers to Paul's eyes in a busted mirror leaning against a wall. In that reflective shard, he looks older and somehow harder because reflections always add a year. A man in Ben's crew misreads the posture and charges. Paul doesn't meet force with force. He slides aside and lets urgency collide with neglect. The man's shin finds the tore rope, and his body finds the ground. The choreography isn't asking for applause. It's asking for breath. Rearing gets the latch. The metal resists like everything in this film that has tried to hold a child in place. She presses, face grim and small and incredibly determined. There's a minute sound, the kind of click Foley artists love because it travels straight to your stomach. The panel gives a fraction. Wind inhales. Her hair lifts. For the first time, the sky looks like a participant rather than a witness. Light pours down the way water does when a dam cracks, not a flood, yet a promise. The whole image warms a degree, not in hue necessarily, but in feeling. And the film allows us a half-second of hope that is so fragile. You don't dare touch it. Ben says enough, and it lands like a cufflink on a table. Everything halts not because authority should always be obeyed, but because the room has been trained to pause when he bookmarks a page. He points not at Paul, not at Vinny, but at the plug on the floor. His instruction is surgical. Restore the cold and we talk. The words flatten people into roles and roles into tasks. Vinny looks at the plug. He looks at Ruin. He looks at Paul. The acting is a masterclass in making a man's insides visible without betraying his dignity. He doesn't cry. He doesn't tremble. He makes a decision and the moment lands so quietly you could miss it. He lifts his foot and presses the prongs half in. Enough to revive the compressor with a begrudging rattle. Not enough to fully seat it. It's petty. It's brilliant. It buys seconds. Seconds is all Paul needs. He steps onto the lowest rung of the ladder and gives it a quarter turn that aligns it under the better beam. The one Ruin's weight has already tested. The one that doesn't sound like an oath breaking. A man blocks him, and there's a brief flurry, where the choreography lets us feel not just impact but doubt. Paul's body has to negotiate with pain it has been. Car. Belong to him anymore. It never did. It belongs to a child trying to open the sky. The skylight surrenders a notch, and the glass shivers in its frame. Not breaking, but warning. Rain draws back an inch, then pushes again, learning the feel of an object about to yield. The way a body learns in play that later becomes survival. Paul reaches one hand up and in the same breath takes a hit to the ribs that will bruise purple and yellow and a kind of green only the injured know. He doesn't hiss. He exhales. His arm doesn't drop. We watch the actor make a choice to play pain without pornographizing it. A choice that honors the film's ethics. You can show suffering without exploiting it. Outside, new sound interrupts the logic of the room. A shutter rattled by hands that aren't cautious. It's not the police, at least not the uniformed kind. It's the impatient percussion of men who believe walls are suggestions. The vibration travels through metal up, beams down into palms and knees and hearts. Everyone turns a fraction tiny. Orientations towards threat that tell an entire history of survival strategies. Ben's crew look to him. Ryan looks for exit counts. Vinny calculates routes without windows. Paul refuses distraction because a hand is more important than a noise. Ruin stops pushing not from fear but from listening. Ben flips the coin again, smaller this time. A private tick. It jumps and clatters on the table for the first time rather than in his hand. An error that is not an error because men like him don't make those. It spins, wobbling, drawing eyes like a tiny planet deciding to be atop. The oscillation sets teeth on edge, a tiny whine that grows as the spin tightens. The film lets it spin almost too long, the way suspense sometimes becomes comedy and then circles back to dread. The coin edges towards the table's lip. It stops on its face, rolling nowhere, a Messier resolution then heads or tails, which feels right in a world that refuses neatness. A footstep on the RO. Without showing itself, Ben looks at him with the kind of patient anger bosses reserve for employees who have made a mess that requires them to get up from their chair. It's the first time we see possibility for fracture in his composure, and the actor plays it on a scale so small it rewards those who sit still. Ruin's rooftops are not empty. A woman watering plants in reproposed cooking oil bottles looks up as a child darts past, and in her eyes moves a calculation that ends with yes. She lifts a sheet on a line as if checking its dryness, and in that movement builds a curtain, a blur, a privacy. Rain slides behind, heart pounding in the close-up. You can hear without seeing. She crawls along a raised seam and finds a narrow bridge of board somebody threw long ago between two buildings out of laziness that today is a blessing. Her sneakers whisper along splintered wood. A pigeon explodes up with the sound of alarmed silk. The city looks both endless and navigable from here. And for a second it feels like this might work, like the sky will hold her without argument. Paul moves with the logic of a man who has studded edges. He doesn't engage the biggest threat because the biggest threat is spectacle. He takes the men who think they are margins and pulls them into the center of the scene. Flipping hierarchy without noise. A wrist, a knee, elbow point to sternum, gentle like a command. He steers one into another. A low collision of intentions that buys ticks of a clock he can spend elsewhere. In one motion, he traps an arm, compresses a throat, just long enough for compliance, releases before sleep arrives. He's not righteous. He's responsible, which is something else and harder. The choreography respects that difference, letting the body read like an essay, rather than a poster. Ryan makes a call without leaving the frame, thumb sliding so businesslike across his screen. It feels like proof he's done this during a funeral. He's not calling police, at least not the kind W. Be the hinge. He runs not toward the ladder, not toward the shutter, but toward the table where the coin spun earlier. He grabs it, puts it in his pocket, looks at Ben with a look that says, I will keep this small thing and you cannot stop me. And that petty theft, that symbolic confiscation, detonates a part of the power structure we didn't realize depended on ritual. Ben blinks and the blink is a fracture. Line. Maybe he believed in that coin more than he admitted, even to himself. Maybe he needed that spin to absolve himself a little every time. Now it's gone. Now he has to be only a person, and that is when people reach for teeth. On the roof, Ruin finds the edge of a building too far to jump. She pauses. Not because fear wins, but because she trusts that there is a third option there always is in children's math. She finds one, a drainage pipe that runs down into a balcony speckled with potted basil. She tests it with a toe, a gentle weight, then folds herself around it like a seedling hugging a stalk. The pipe complains in a tired creak. Her descent is a hint to gravity negotiated with patience. The camera keeps her face in frame enough to let us breathe with her, then cuts wide just long enough to remind us how small she is against a world that is not designed for her. Except in the way it works when kindness arranges itself. The shutter finally gives, lifted from the outside by strong arms that work to wedge. Light drills the room. It isn't rescue. It's opinion. Two figures slide under. Not police and not gang. Just delivery guys who took a detour to help a stuck door because they were paid or because they care. We never learn. They freeze at the sight. One of them laughs. The stunned little laugh a person makes at a painting they didn't expect to understand. It breaks the spell. Human reality barges into myth. Ben's hand lifts and the men at the shutter usher the outsiders back with a kind of non-threat that communicates their interest in not escalating. The regards her. The owner of those eyes never gets a name, and that feels correct. She lifts the latch, lets the child in, closes only halfway, as if believing that half-open doors are safer than locked ones because they keep air moving. Ruin whispers a tiny thank you like a bird. The woman nods as if this is just Monday. She hands the child a glass of water because adults who know things know that the first thing a body needs after terror is a sip. The camera lingers on that glass because the film is obsessed with liquids, blood, rain, sweat, tea, and here water is the opposite of everything the cooler stands for. It's common, shared enough. Paul registers a small noise in the upper world, a safe exhale rather than an alarm, and makes a decision of proportionality. He stops fighting to leave. He fights to stop the fight. He throws his weight into making the room into a place where talking has to happen because action is exhausted. He uses leverage that damages pride rather than flesh. He lets one man take his shoulder and uses that contact to signal the end of that arc. He's fond of the kind of clinch where foreheads almost touch. It looks intimate because it is. It's a language no one writes down. When he drops his hands, the film gives him the dignity of not being fortissimo about it. He's not surrendering. He's finishing his part. Ryan senses the shift and slides back into speech like a fish finding a familiar current. He suggests with only the faintest whiff of condescension that the child is gone. Enough for now, and they need not pretend otherwise. He pivots to debt, to calendar, to incremental blood drawn under sterile circumstances. He dresses harm in forms, then lets him talk, and in that permission lies an admission. Control is shared and therefore diluted. The power triangle has become a trapezoid because a child added a node by climbing into the sky and refusing to be counted. It's not a victory. It's an algebra lesson about resilience. Vinny does something small. Look up nervously as if heaven might drop judgment. The sound design is exquisite here, giving us a kind of tinnitus of relief. That ringing that follows a too loud moment. The body adjusting, recording a before and after. The film doesn't chase ruin now. It leaves her with the unnamed woman with water, with the mundane kindness that keeps countries from falling apart. It returns to the men and asks them to live here in the complicity they've created. Ben says, it's over for today. Not in triumph, in accounting terms. He signals his men to gather themselves the way people fold chairs after a ceremony that went on too long. Ryan pats the top of the cooler like a man blessing a machine. Paul looks at Vinny, and the look is a contract no lawyer has words for. They will go, they will move, they will make the city both further and closer. And the work of keeping a child uncounted will continue tomorrow and the day after until a different system exists. The aftermath doesn't arrange itself into montage. It unspools like thread that needs untangling. We follow Rain through a warren of apartments until she ends up in a temple kitchen where an old man beats eggs like his remembering music. And she waits there with a stray cat X-shaped across her lap. She draws again the shark, but now it has a clouds puff word balloon not above but inside it. An admission that transformation isn't escape, it's infusion. Paul arrives late, clothes wet with warehouse air, and kneels. He doesn't touch her right away. He sits and his body tells her it's safe to make the first move. She does. The small hand that earlier left oil on glass now leaving a thumbprint of flour on his knee. It's absurd and holy. Ryan recalibrates with predatory calm, settling debts, smoothing the wrinkle their failure made. He visits the clinic with a donation, shakes a hand, and with that handshake reinstates a pipeline only marginally less fragile than the first. He deletes a thread of messages. He tells a driver to T. First. He deletes a thread of messages. He tells a driver to take a different route home. He believes in days that look like other days. The film grants him a coda that is neither condemnation nor forgiveness. A shot of him alone in an office late pools on spreadsheets. A small unguarded sigh. He is not haunted. He is tired. The world runs on people like him. And that is the horror the movie refuses to soften. Ben disappears into the city with the efficiency of a man who has rehearsal for exit baked into his bones. Rumors bloom and then die. That he moved to a port city. That he was seen in a hospital with a niece. That someone found his coin in a drain. None are confirmed. The film declines to give him a spectacle of downfall because it isn't that kind of moralist. It knows systems. Migrate like birds. It trusts us to be angry about that in a way that sustains action, not in a way that satisfies hunger for tidy endings. Paul's ex-wife gets one scene luminous enough to break something in you. He goes to her not to beg and not to insist. He carries the pendant his daughter wore the night of the accident. The chain knotted where panic pulled it broken, repaired with a clumsy fix that is a story of its own. He lays it at a small shrine crowded with silent things, dried flowers, a photograph grainy enough to make everyone kinder. He tells her nothing he hasn't said before. And yet everything is different because he doesn't ask her to carry any of it this time. The performance here between two actors who refuse to cheat by going big plays in the minute muscles around eyes that learn to cry until they didn't anymore. She hands him a small cloth bag, the kind that holds herbs or coins or wishes. Inside is nothing we see. It's better that way. If there's a fight left in him, the film places it in a space that feels like an apology for all the ring lights and chant and sweaty bets. It's in a gym with a ceiling fan that clacks on the odd rotation. An old wood floor that tells you who is heavy-footed and who learned soft steps. He spars with a kid too eager and gently, insistently teaches him to breathe between punches. The instruction is a quiet echo of the readiness he gave Ruin. Count, breathe, then move. He shows the kid how to tape hands without strangling fingers. He says without needing to be formal about it that fighting is the last thing you do, not the first. And that winning has no meaning if you forget what you're protecting. Composer and sound designer find the end not with crescendo but with subtraction. The gamelan voices that ghosted earlier tracks return, but they sound older, woodier, like instruments that were kept in a chest and have tiny cracks now that make them more interesting. The percussion that drove the first fight sequences evaporates into hand drums so soft they could be heartbeat or traffic 2 streets over. The cooler's hum becomes a motif you realize you've been hearing in your own kitchen your whole life. The domestic machine that keeps things from spoiling given a new moral ask. What do we keep cold? What do we allow to warm back into life? Cinematography closes its loop with light. The last third breathes daylight in like medicine but never weaponizes it into simplicity. Interiors are soft, faces gentle with texture that digital cameras used to chase away and now invite back. Exteriors greet rain not as mood but as climate. The final scene under the sky refuses golden hour sentimentality. It screamed. He returns not to reenact but to live differently near the same edge. He walks out to knee depth, bends without submerging, scoops a handful of water. Let it leak through fingers that now refuse to hold too tight. He calls 2 names, one gone, one safe, and the sound goes not up to heaven, but out over the surface to where boats drag wakes like pencils on paper. He doesn't cry. The film doesn't need to show that to prove his humanity anymore. He breathes, each exhale and unlearning. When he turns back, Vinny and Rin are on the shore with a kite that is mostly string and a paper scrap that wants to be air. The wind is barely there, so they run to make the wind. The kite lifts, fights, dips, and catches. Ririn laughs, and it's the mortar that holds the last sequence together. The camera tracks it up, then loses it against the glare for a second, then finds it again. A small white insistence in a huge day. Paul holds the slack gently, lets the tug teach his palms a new vocabulary. He doesn't cling, he steadies. The shark cloud draws itself somewhere above them, and everyone in frame looks a little less like they're surviving and a little more like they're living. Acting in Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer is calibrated like a safe cracker's ear, tuned to click rather than bang. The actor playing Paul builds an architecture of restraint that only someone confident in their craft attempts. You watch choices being made not for your benefit but for his own moral continuity, and the result is a portrait of a man whose power is in how little he is willing to perform. The performer behind Vinny pulls off the hardest thing. He makes decency cinematic. It's in the way he stands in doorways, in the specificity of the way his fingers hover near plugs and cups, and Little girl's shoulders, in the ledger he holds in his eyes where love and cost are written on the same line. Ben is terrifying because his actor avoids villain notes. He plays logic like a song he believes is pretty. And that makes you realize how many dangerous men get to make their own soundtrack. Ryan's actor understands how the world flatters men who speak quietly while doing harm loudly. He lets charm be a casing for a hollow core that is not emptiness so much as insulation. The directional sense of camera presence feels like a collaboration between people who know how to watch a body think. It commits to physical geography and to faces with equal passion, refuses coverage that flatters editors at the expense of clarity, anchors us in space so that when it breaks its own rules, the break is felt more than noticed. Cutting patterns are just by domain or the ring, the apartment, the market, the warehouse, the temple. Each has a syntax. That discipline lets the film modulate tension without cheap sugar highs, building a metabolic rhythm that makes time feel elastic and, in the end, precious. The script's moral intelligence lies in its refusal to let symbols swallow people. Blood is blood, a complicated fluid with logistics attached and a history tied to colonial medicine and contemporary capitalism. It knows that and doesn't sermonize it. It shows the tubes and printers and cold boxes, and then lets a glass of water redeem the idea of a liquid that answers to care. Poison is literal, the early bottle, but it is also the certainty that you can allocate harm as if you were moving tokens on a board. The antidote is never one big thing. It is tiny reallocations of attention. A man who turns a ladder sideways. A small foot placed where a heel felt safe a second ago. A plug left half in. A coin taken from a ritual. Heroism is granular. The film is wise enough to be way no award will acknowledge. It stays in love with the idea that a kite can make a wind if enough human running agrees. Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer at its last breath is a film that understands the difference between closure and repair. Closure is what we demand from stories because our lives don't give it to us. Repair is what we do for one another so that endings don't have to be tidy to be honorable. The final images hold steady on faces that have stopped acting like they're being watched. And in that rare choice is a respect that film often forgets it owes. If this journey stirred something in you, if the warehouse hum still lingers in your kitchen, if you tasted the salt at the waterline, if you saw in Paul's fists a promise not to harm but to hold, then you know why we stay in the dark and watch light argue with shadow for 2 hours. On Scene Craft Review, this is the conversation I want to keep having with you about films that are more than stories. They are ways of living for a little while in someone else's problem and coming away with a better question. If you felt that, hit like so the algorithm knows this kind of deep dive matters. Subscribe if you want more long immersive breakdowns of cinema that dares to be human, and drop a comment telling me the moment that hit you hardest. Was it the click of the skylight, the glass of water in the kitchen, the coin spinning and then refusing to decide? Share this with someone who thinks fight movies can't be